Awesome. Yeah, firstly, thank you so much to the organizers for this event, and thank you to all the other speakers today. It's been so cool, and now I have a reading list an arm long length, to go away and read. So thank you so much, and thank you to Rob as well. So today I am going to talk about why and how I use kelp and seaweed in my art practice, using two different works as examples, and how they relate to ideas on non-linear materiality and queer and trans ecologies. I will be showing images and videos from these pieces, but I'll also be incorporating images from experiments and upcoming works that respond to the same themes. The first work is titled Prototype 1, What Can This Primary Container Do? And is an interactive installation that invites a participant to put on a textile sculpture. Inside this wearable piece is an accelerometer, or a movement sensor, a battery, a main Arduino board, and a tiny radio sewn in with conductive thread, which relays the movement data to a video being projected around the wearer. As the wearer moves, it triggers the video to move faster and slower, depending on their movement. The video is comprised of kelp-like shapes made of flowery, kitschy fabric, ghostly, strangely textured shapes that inflate and deflate, bob and bow, and generally flail around in response to your movement. Participants are invited to experience this work alone, to perform a body in a dreamlike world. The architecture of this in-between world is designed to bring together the natural queerness of nature and the glitchy artificiality of a 3D world that allows me to create a body that reflects how I see myself. The second work, titled The Body Was Left in California, is a short video in which multiple strands of glass kelp sway gently as a fuzzy background video of underwater locations changes behind them. It is unclear where you are or what time period you might be in or what planet you might be on, as something that looks like an alien spacecraft whizzes past. Unnaturally brightly colored rocks are illuminated and some sort of giant shell palace glows brightly in the gloom. I've turned the video, the sound off for today, but both these videos also incorporate soundscapes which layer archived field recordings of water, samples of sci-fi theme tunes, sci-fi concept albums, and data sonification of planets. To give a short overview of my work before delving into the central role that kelp's playing in it, my work explores the myriad potentialities of inhabiting a non-binary body. I work predominantly with textiles and 3D images and view them as complementary materials to build worlds that reflect the non-linear way I experience self, time, and materiality. Messiness and glitchiness are important techniques for me across the mediums I work with, as they allow me to challenge or destabilize hierarchies of skill, value, and labor within the craft field, as well as creating environments that reflect the process of materializing one's body. My work is meant to be touched, to be tried on or invited inside of, and some installations are designed to be experienced on your own or with other people. In both works that I'm talking about today, artificial 3D renderings of kelp made with the open source software program Blender are used as watery or liquid bodies that represent the non-binary body. But before we get into the slimy world of 3D kelp, I'd like to talk a little bit about the body itself. We talk about the body all the time, especially in art speak, but it feels important to pull this concept apart a little bit. My work is predicated around the idea of how I can construct my own body and the murkiness of bodily boundaries that is very specific to my own experience. When we generalize the idea of bodies, and this applies to all categories of identity, we ignore the plurality and the politics of difference within that category. When we talk about the trans body, it centers the idea of a standardized ideal or a specific kind of body that stands in for an entire group of people. By referring to the trans body without specificity, as Gordon Hall writes in their essay, Why I Don't Talk About the Body, quote, we linguistically create a culture in which people are interchangeable with one another within categories of difference. This then leads to either the exclusion or disappearance of people within that wider category, or leads people to look for, and I quote Hall again here, visible markers of difference, loading them with significance that eclipses the particularity and diversity of the individuals within an identity category. These markers or ideas of what one should and shouldn't look like are inevitably internalized, and the expectation that one can present a legible, palatable example of a singular understanding of being non-binary and trans is simply not possible, and nor should it be desirable. In her excellent book, Glitch Feminism, the writer Legacy Russell talks about how there is no accurate mirror for the self, and how people are rarely truly seen, especially through the lens of race and gender. She talks about how restrictions placed on people forces them to, quote, invent ways to create space through rupture. And this idea of creating worlds that house alternative versions of one's body that could be indecipherable is really at the heart of my practice and examinations of materiality, embodiment, and transcorporeal reality. I'd initially been thinking about my body in atmospheric terms, inspired by reading Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his writing on sexuality as atmosphere, and wanting to extend this idea to viewing the body as an atmosphere. And somewhere along the line, this came crashing down from the atmospheric heavens and into the watery depths. Much of my textile work is about creating wearable sculptures in environments that reimagine the body and allow for new interpretations and possibilities. These sculptures are fluid and organic and seek to blur bodily boundaries. The goal is to make something constantly in the state of becoming, in flux and changing. And seeing the work as liquid allows a new perspective on the porous relationship between this materializing body and its surroundings. In my previous textile sculptures, I often use multiple layers of long threads hanging down, and these sculptures in motion always reminded me of plants and seaweed moving with the tides. So it felt very logical to start exploring this idea of kelp. I'd been reading Astrid and Neimanis's work, Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, and was struck by the idea of using my kelp interpretations as an amplifier of my own body. Centering these liquid kelp bodies in a liquid system allows for a total reimagination of the self. One can view these systems and bodies as a process, changing and flowing and incompressible. There is potential to be a non-body, with no formal boundaries, and one can assert their identity through an environmental context. It is a push towards non-coherence, to be able to be leaky and spill out, to negotiate and push into different spaces. It is also for me an opportunity to explore ideas on legibility and observation by deliberately choosing to remove any physical references or traces of my own body from the work and replace them with kelp. By combining the 3D kelp representations with physical textile work, the labor of creating oneself is still evident in the handmade, and these aspects are in constant dialogue and tension. In the Prototype 1 installation, you're not only obscuring your body by physically taking on a new one, you also become part of an interactive scene within this kelp forest. There is an ambiguity in the relationship between the participant and the kelp forest. The shapes react to your movement, but perhaps your movements are also shaped by being in the situation. The kelp reaches out and responds to you, and perhaps as an observer, you are aware of being part of an ecosystem. And even if it is unclear what that system entails, your presence is enough. And the ecosystem of kelp is very much at the back of my mind as I create these environments. Kelp forests are often densely grouped around each other, connected to the sea floor, but reaching up to the sun, providing shelter and nutrients to the surrounding sea life. Kelp are also involved in mutualistic relationships with sea mammals and tiny sea invertebrates. So this idea of relationality is very interesting to me. How do environments of co-constitutive care work, and how could this feed into the worlds that I'm interested in creating? In both pieces, the kelp are intended as sites of intake, transformation, and exchange, not only in a private, intimate sphere between your body and the surroundings, but also what that could mean for wider, alternative, non-linear systems of support. In the second piece, the kelp forest is completely transparent and glass-like, allowing the observer to see through them as they partially blend into their surroundings, but still draw your eye to their movement. Here, the glass kelp functions as constant observers to the changing environments around them. And these environments are artificial, handmade tableaus of imagined science fiction futures created in the 1960s, and a vehicle for me to explore non-linear idea of time and memory. I wasn't alive for the original TV series that these background clips are taken from, and I watched them much later as a child of the 80s and early 90s, but I'm interested in being nostalgic for things that you did not experience or places you've never been, and how concepts of experienced time can be bent, reshaped, and subverted. It is also about being out of time, to quote Lee Edelman, and creating a liminal space for an understanding of oneself. Our understandings of time and nature are socially constructed, and the opportunity to subvert those expectations allows for a retelling of histories and interactions. The changing backgrounds in the video piece are fragmented snapshots that do not give a clear indication of location, stuck in an alluring and alienating loop. Time and terrain are not linear or organized. There is no sense of anything truly happening in these scenes, but perhaps a sense of being on the cusp of an event or the aftershock of one. It is unclear as well whether these spaces are occupied. Do the inhabitants of the shuttle live underwater as well, or are they visitors from the surface? Who, if anyone, lives in the Shell Palace? I keep saying palace, but it looks like a tower block. It's very J.G. Ballard meets The Little Mermaid. Naimanis, in the book I mentioned earlier, talks about water being a politics of location. And we can view that across ideas of water and sovereignty, or in terms of the climate crisis and its impact on the living organisms under the sea, as well as all of us who depend on water. But it also perhaps can be a choice of where one chooses to situate themselves or their relation to others. All these politics of location are, of course, connected. One cannot make work or write about this without acknowledging that the themes of kinship with nature, especially resisting extraction and assimilation, are a deep part of queer and trans studies, Indigenous studies, climate studies, critical race studies, and disability studies. This politics of location, according to Naimanis, is about an embodied location and a way to center the materiality of the body. In this watery space, I'm then able to craft an understanding of myself through both the creation of the individual kelp pieces and the textile sculptures together, as well as building the wider landscape for interactions. It is also an intentional choice to place myself in this setting, in this natural setting. Being unnatural is a charge often leveled at trans people, whether it is the externally perceived unnaturalness of bodily changes or some idea of going against the natural order of things. The unnaturalness of your location is always deeply felt. Moral regulation of bodies and spaces is a widely discussed topic, and creating my own unstable and artificial watery environments allows me to explore these ideas through the lens of queer and trans ecologies. The moral regulation of natural spaces is interesting to me, especially in queer theory, with concepts of sexual perversity tied to the immoral city and ecological decline. Much of this theory is, of course, tied to deviant sexuality and non-reproductive activities, but it stands alongside trans ecology in their aims to reclaim the natural, the idea of belonging and intimacy within these settings. Trans ecology is, as Anne Bedford writes in the introduction to the recent book Trans Ecology, Trans Perspectives on Environment and Nature, an opportunity to turn to, quote, a theoretical place where cis heteropatriarchy may not reign supreme. This theoretical place is an opportunity for world building and non-performance. The sea floor, and indeed kelp, is not necessarily a place immediately or widely synonymous with queerness or transness. For me, queerness and the sea definitely go together, but I find them more connected to either maritime queer lust away from the constraints of societal norms on land, or in the relationships between the marine animals. If anything, the depths of the sea floor are closer to science fiction and mythology, a landscape of unknowns and undiscovered possibilities inhabitants. Although having said that, I do think the alien from the movie Abyss is pretty queer. To create an artificial landscape populated with artificial kelp is intended to signal a landscape of uncertainty, a site for experimentation and new kinds of encounters and reconfigurations that take place outside of time, space, and the limitations of language. I'm not necessarily striving for utopias or dystopias, but rather figuring out how to position non-binariness in an unknown watery space where one does not have to articulate themselves or present a legible or consumable body. Thank you so much for listening.